The Biden White House is considering welcoming some Palestinians who are fleeing the war-torn Gaza Strip as refugees in the United States. According to federal government documents, it is shown that in the past few weeks, U.S. officials have discussed options to relocate Palestinians from Gaza who have immediate family members that are American citizens or permanent residents. The Gazans who pass certain eligibility, medical, and security tests would qualify to fly to the U.S. as refugees.
In other news, reporting directly from Hamas yesterday, said that Hamas is sending a delegation to Egypt to continue ceasefire talks, a sign that a deal could be closer to end the war in Gaza and return the Israeli hostages. In Tel Aviv on Thursday, family members of hostages and their supporters protested in front of the nation's military headquarters while the war cabinet convened. The protesters, using loudspeakers, counted to 209, the number of days that have passed since the hostages were seized. Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu has said in the past the IDF will go into Rafah and won't stop its war until Hamas is eradicated. Meanwhile, Turkey halted all trade with Israel yesterday. Turkey's trade ministry posted on social media, Turkey will strictly and decisively implement these new measures until the Israeli government allows an uninterrupted and sufficient flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza. So what comes next for Israel and Gaza? I think, we're at the point where there needs to be a mutual exchange of hostages among Palestine and among Israel. But Netanyahu has indicated time and again that he would not be happy with a Palestinian state post-war. So this goal of eradicating Hamas has been in the past identical with his goal of eradicating Palestine. And that's something that the United States has said they do not support. And I think taking in refugees from Gaza isn't an ideal solution for Palestinians either. They want to be on their own land. They want to be home. So it seems that although ceasefire talks will be happening in Egypt, there's not a clear path that makes Israel or Palestinians happy.
Yeah, I wonder, does Hamas feel the same way about Israel, that they would not want an Israel state to exist after the war?
I wouldn't know. I think many people living in Palestine are not happy with Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. And, there was a period in time where there were these peace talks going on, where there was a two-state solution that was brokered, and the prime minister of Israel that was in support of it was assassinated by the far right in Israel, and that's who's in power now. And so there was a point in time where it was the case that there was a two-state solution that was brokered through peace talks, but I think we're in a position today where it's going to take quite a bit of time and different lines drawn before we get there.
Yeah, there's also some new polling about American attitudes towards the war in Gaza, and it's pretty interesting because we've obviously talked a lot about the Israeli opposition in America and the protests on college campuses and some of the splits in the Democratic Party, specifically pushing Joe Biden to be more on the Palestinian side of things and to end funding from Israel. But when we look at polling from some of the biggest polling operations in the United States, we see that 4 out of 5 Americans still favor Israel over Hamas or Palestine, and most of them back Israel finishing the war by having its invasion into Rafah. And so I think we have to be careful sometimes about giving too much weight to these smaller, more vocal contingents in the United States, because we have to recognize as well that most Americans are still in favor of Israel continuing its offensive into Gaza. And so that's going to have an effect as well as to whether Biden continues to support the negotiations process right now and whether or not he would pull support from Israel if they decide to continue with its invasion into Rafah.
Yeah, I think we're at a point in time where so often the Biden administration is asked about Rafah, and they're just brushing it off as if it's no big deal. And as Israel continues to go into new territory, it's not just eradicating Hamas. They're taking the territory, they're leveling buildings, they're making it so that Palestine in Gaza is not a habitable place for Palestinians post-war. So even if they politically do agree and say, yes, there can be a Palestine post-war, they're actively preventing it with their military action. And so what needs to happen now is the Biden administration, if they're interested in peace whatsoever, It needs to be an immediate no into going into Rafah, into doing a ground campaign. It needs to be an immediate no into any further ground campaigns by the IDF. And they should restrict the military aid going to Palestine, which they haven't. They just passed this massive bipartisan bill where they're sending additional dollars to Israel at a point in time when it's an unpopular policy among the American public. And so really, I see the only way forward is for the United States to use their influence as Israel's number one ally, number one supporter of their military, to say absolutely not, no more. It's very clear that you're not being precise about eradicating Hamas, which is the goal you keep saying to the media. You need to actually take into consideration that Palestine has its right to self-determination as well, and that Israel is currently jeopardizing that. And we can put this in the context of history of what Israel's done in the past, but if we just deal with it for what's happening right now, it is the case that it's not a reasonable response, if it's framed as a response to the attack on October 7th, to make Gaza an unlivable place for all of the civilians who lived there before in the name of eradicating Hamas. And so I really think the Biden administration is making a huge mistake by not using their influence to prevent this ground invasion into Rafah.
Let's talk about this plan that they supposedly have to admit Palestinian refugees into the United States. I would oppose this on two major grounds. The first is that when we talk about refugees around the world, typically we would expect that the surrounding countries would be responsible for taking in those individuals. But none of the Arab states around Palestine want to take Palestinian refugees. That, of course, doesn't absolve them from the fact that they, being the surrounding areas, have a greater responsibility to take them than the United States. But then we get into why exactly that is and why I think it would be problematic to bring in Palestinian refugees without really strict ideological screenings, which, frankly, the Department of Homeland Security does not really have in place right now. There's no good way to screen on ideological grounds for people coming into the U.S. There is one pollster in Palestine who is known as the Gallup of Palestine. He runs the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, and the latest poll that he did found that over 70% of Palestinians supported the October 7th massacre in Israel. The vast majority of them support Hamas. 98% of them viewed the U.S. very negatively, and the vast majority of them viewed Hamas positively. There's also a lot of research into sexual violence against women in Palestine and the way that women are subjugated there. So I'm very reticent to accept people from a country that, frankly, culturally, its values don't align with our own. I think we need to be really careful about that. We saw some really tragic stories happen when we started accepting Afghan refugees after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where they were placed on military bases. And within a week or two, we started having reports of women being sexually assaulted, of children being abused, because we did not properly screen the refugees who came from Afghanistan, while, by the way, we abandoned American citizens and people who had actually worked with the U.S. military during the Afghan war. So I don't want us to make that same mistake with the Palestinian refugee crisis that's surely to come, where we take in a bunch of people who are either not interested in assimilating into our culture, or just bring with them these practices that frankly don't comport with how we view humanity and how we treat people here.
Yeah, what practices are you worried about coming to the U.S. from the citizens of Gaza?
Sexual abuse and violence towards women primarily.
Among the Gazan civilians?
Yeah, among Palestinians. So the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics in 2006 found that 61.7% of married women experienced psychological abuse, 23% physical violence, and 11% sexual violence. Unfortunately, they don't track data on unmarried women because the practice is banned in Palestine. But that's the best available statistics we have. I mean, those are obviously stunningly high for a married relationship, 23% experiencing physical violence, 1 in 4. If they believe that that is moral or acceptable due to whatever cultural or religious practices they have, then absolutely I don't want them in the United States.
In the United States, we have 1 in 3 women who are sexually assaulted and 1 in 9 men. And so when we compare the two cultures, we find that unfortunately what we're seeing in crimes against women it's pretty common that we have women experiencing sexual violence in the West and in countries like Palestine and in the Middle East. So I really see this as, not that being a concern here. My concern here is that Palestinians want to live in their home. Gazans want to live in Gaza. And that's not being made an option, in part thanks to American weapons sold to the Israeli military used to level Gaza and make it uninhabitable. And so it's, again, another case of U.S. intervention, even if indirectly. I would argue it's direct if the weapons are being sold to Israel and used, but it's not American troops on the ground. So I think people would differ with me on that. In any case, we are responsible, even by Biden's standards, who said that they hold Iran responsible for what happened to the Yemeni shipping simply because they're funding the Houthi rebels. And so you're in this situation where, even by these neoliberal standards, we are responsible here in creating this refugee crisis where a lot of the neighboring countries don't want to take in Palestinians when their home has been leveled. And the U.S. says, okay, well, it seems like the only real, solution foreign policy wise here is for us to adjust our expectations and say we're willing to take them in. But ultimately, these Palestinians don't want to live in the United States. They've seen the United States part in destroying their homeland and destroying their country. And so really the political solution here would be for the United States to help invest honestly in rebuilding Palestine, because the United States directly profited from, contributed to, and encouraged its destruction at this point. And so the solution is not to take in Palestinians as refugees. The solution is to allow the Palestinians to continue to live in their homeland post-war and to be an active, participant in these negotiations that will result in a ceasefire.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to get into the 1 in 3 statistic for sexual assault in America, but I would encourage viewers to check out Christina Hoff Sommers' video debunking that statistic. There's a lot of issues with it. It's brought up repeatedly, particularly under Obama in his Department of Education, in order to justify getting rid of due process for men on college campuses who were accused of assault and harassment. So I think it's important that people check that out. And there's also a difference fundamentally between the way that we view sexual violence against women in America, because we do view it as morally wrong. Unfortunately, in some Islamic countries, they view it as justified because women are subjugated by a matter of religious course, and not to mention the fact that they view marriage differently, whereas the man actually owns the women. So in a lot of cases, marital rape is actually not even considered a rape because women are supposed to be required to sexually fulfill their husbands by whatever means necessary. So I do think there is a disconnect morally between our two cultures, but if they don't want to come to America and I don't want them to come, then it sounds like we agree and the problem is solved. We'll be back with more Rising after this.